One of the things that I guess happens with data analysis is people often talk to me about um, analysis paralysis, and it's kind of interesting. So it's kind of that piece where you feel like oftentimes you're getting started or you're just beginning, when really I'd argue that the data analysis starts with really the first few interviews. And in fact, even when you're writing the proposal, you're thinking about the type of data you might want to get, and how you might think about that data so in advance. So even though we talk about it as being a discrete part of the process, I'd argue it's kind of involved in the whole part. So I wanted to start a little bit with data collection. Especially as grad students, we kind of go out and we collect the data, and I think as you're collecting it, you really think about the data. So your analysis kind of begins, at the moment you start speaking with the participant. So a case study that I could share is a study I did with South Asian men at Sikh temples, and they ran a little clinic there, a little health clinic for men and women, and it was really about blood sugar testing, blood pressure checks, things like that. And I observed, out at the temple, some of those interactions. So in this slide, I share with you some of the things I saw, and it's quite, kind of descriptive, but it's more of a recount rather than a reflection on what happened. But what I find is that oftentimes when you're out working with people, you tend to write down the things that you see so as you remember them, and then you start to think about them and start to build your analysis around what you saw and how you felt about it and what you think you might have been seeing. And so here, this is a little slide that kind of describes how I think about field notes. So what I've seen, I put down. So here is an example where I said there was some humour that was used, and this was in relation to a prostate cancer support group study where we were going out and watching the interactions of the men and the women that go to the groups. And humour was used a lot, and so they'd use it at the front end to invite people into the space. And so I put a little thought there around analysis, and so I started to believe that humour was used as an icebreaker. When the content or the introspection was a little bit too uncomfortable for people, they'd use humour to distance themselves, or they'd bring humour out to bring people into a group, because it's not really typical of men to talk about health, for example. So it's kind of, as you're seeing things, you're starting to think about it. And those things, both of those little pieces of analysis were papers in the end product about 2 years after all of this data was collected. So again, the analysis really started early. So I just say that, my point in all of that little, prelude piece is that we really do the analysis from the beginning of getting into the field, especially with ethnographic work, where we're observing people as well as interviewing them. Interviews are interesting too. As graduate students, we kind of do our own interviews, and then when you move into a tenure track position, oftentimes you're distanced from the interviews because you don't do all of them. You might do some of them, might do a few of them, and in some studies you might actually come into the data cold, without having actually interviewed people. I just think that with interviews, your analysis again, it's beginning with your interaction with the person. So if you were fortunate enough to be in that room to be able to conduct the interviews with their focus group interviews or individual interviews, the things that you observe and the interactions in and around the interview are key to your analysis as well. If I had my choice, I'd be at every interview, but I'd probably be a little bit busy around with the other things that I've got to do. But as graduate students, I always fondly remember my PhD as a time when I was there for every piece of the data collection, and I knew the data so well that at one point I was having difficulty stopping writing the analysis. It was kind of one of those ones where you're so deeply in it. So again, if you're in there and you're doing the interviews, I'd suggest that it's incumbent on us all to be really thinking about the data as we go. Interview guides are interesting. Oftentimes I go back to the interview guide when I've got the data in and I'm wanting to do an analysis. One of the earliest things I do is I go back and I go, well, what was the script in the first place? What did we actually think about? What did we want to ask? What did we ask? And what were the research questions? So I go back to the research questions before I look at the transcripts to remind me of what I said I wanted to do. because there's a little bit of seduction in qualitative work, because sometimes the questions that you came up with are answered, but there's some really interesting ones that you didn't really have at the beginning that you start to go, wow, I'd like to explore that. And I think it's a bit of a trick, because you're fooling yourself a little bit. I think you really do have to answer the questions you first put out there, and then once you've done that, in the form of analysis and papers, then you can go back in and look at the other data. But it's always a good reminder to go back to the script about why you were doing what you were doing and the actual research questions. So again, one of the reasons that we kind of do data analysis early on in the data collection is that it avoids what we say is like information overload. So for every 90-minute interview, it's 30 to 40 pages of transcript. You have 35 people in a study. All of a sudden, you're just inundated with this data. And so if you're thinking about the data as you're collecting it, it's way less of an overload, because you're kind of already in there. So we try to get into the data before we finish data collection in that way. But when you put it all together, it's pretty tough. It's often a lot of paper and a lot of work going back through it and thinking about it. And the toughest thing for me is that it all matters. So I'm a bit of a hoarder. I like to keep the data because it's all the stories are really important, and I want to tell every one of them. And so it can be a bit of a challenge to you've got to let go of some things, and you've got to find that sweet spot where you've got an illustrative quote that talks to the finding, but that you haven't got 10 of those quotes, because they'll never actually see the light of day. So you have to kind of triage a little bit in terms of keeping data, and using data. So where to start? Typically, I'm old school. I start with a hard copy, and I kind of read through the whole transcript. So a good way also, if you're looking to mix it up a little bit, is to listen to the audio record, because there's a lot of inflection in voice and things, and to think about that interview and cast your mind back to it if you were there, or to orientate yourself if you weren't there, and to hear the person speak and pick up a few nuances in that way as well. And you can enter them into the transcript and just remind yourself of some of the things that you were hearing or seeing as nonverbal. So it can be really helpful in that way. So I proof it in that way. I get a sense of the whole by really reading through a transcript. I only do one transcript a day. So I do a transcript and I'll summarise it for the key pieces. So I'll kind of make some jottings in the corner. But as the minute I start getting into 2 interviews and 3 interviews, it starts to bleed. And at the point of getting a sense of the whole, where I start with individual interviews is to try and understand what was going on for that person. And then, the next day, if I've got time, I'll do another one, so forth, so on. And sometimes it takes 6 months to get through the data. Sometimes you can get through in a few weeks. But I tend to sort of think about just one a day. A great mentor of mine, Joan Vitorf, gave me the word dross early on, and dross refers to the pieces in the data that really can be amazingly interesting but won't help you answer your questions. So they're the parts you've got to let go of early on. So it can take you off on these blind-ended alleys, cul-de-sacs, if you get caught in the dross. So, if there's things there that really don't answer the question that you started out with, my suggestion is, leave that off to the side and go with the things that will help you answer the question. I use word processors a little bit with the data, so you can just have your Word version opened, and you can just make little comments on track changes. It's a really, for people who don't want to work in hard copy, it's a terrific way, and also it's a nice way of having the record there, without having to go back through 35 hard copy interviews and stuff. You can kind of pull it up a little bit quicker and do searches on certain terms that can help you find the data a little bit quicker. So for on-screen stuff, the word processing can be really good. So just comments, you can put in with track changes, and even a few editorials if you're feeling the need. The other thing, I get the old felt pens out and I highlight the bits that I think are important. So I'll have a transcript, I'll be going through, I'll be reading through it, and I'll be thinking about the research questions. and I'll highlight the things that I think are important. The trouble early on with this technique is I often end up, kind of highlighting nearly everything. Again, I'm a hoarder, and but as you go on, you start to see things that repeat in the transcripts, and then I find that as I get into third, fourth, fifth transcript, I'm highlighting less because I'm narrowing my thoughts about, I can see this piece. There's the piece here that I want to work with. Here's a piece where I can see a theme that's kind of emerging because it's kind of everyone talks to this particular piece. So we're doing ones at the moment around men's depression and suicide, and it's interesting because a lot of the guys will talk to suicidal thoughts, so it's a nice easy way to just highlight those bits where people are talking to them, and just in the corner just say suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, and then I've got them throughout the whole data set to sort of go back to if I need to, which I will in this particular case. The way that a lot of people use or do analysis is with the aid of a qualitative software. So it's kind of interesting. This can be, I would argue that NVivo and like programs can actually be a barrier to analysis, because people often are they're seduced by the idea of coding, and coding's not analysis. Coding is a way of clumping together things that are like-minded or look similar. So it's a way of doing that, but you still got to go back into that data and read it and think about it, and then anchor it back into the person who you were talking to. So NVivo is good because it helps you arrange the data, but I would be very clear that it doesn't analyze the data for you. It's a pattern in which you can hold data, and you can do exactly the same with a word processor in terms of cutting and pasting quotes and working it in that way. So you can tell I'm not a great fan. I do like it. I don't like big elaborate, coding schedules. So for example, what we tend to do is we'll come up with maybe 8 or 10 codes, very broad codes. So I'd call them big fractures or large fractures. And then we'll go back in and look at those codes one by one. And oftentimes there's a paper in every one of those codes because the themes will be within the codes. So if you come up with a really nice coding schedule, but it's got like 40 or 50 codes, I'll guarantee you that you'll end up having to subsume some of those codes, and it won't necessarily get you to the paper or to the end of your dissertation quite as quickly as if you kind of just keep the fractures broad and keep working the data to go back in and read it. So, I think NVivo used well and similar are terrific things, so don't get me wrong, but ultimately the work of analysis is about reading and thinking, and it doesn't do that for you. You can see here, again, we've uploaded all of the different transcripts, all the individual transcripts here for a study about gay men and intimate partner violence, and we've listed them all there, and we've uploaded these 14, and then you can see we can go into each one of these particular transcripts and we can start looking at what the participant said. So it can help us look in that way, and then literally just like a highlighter pen, you highlight it running the cursor over and you connect it to one of the nodes. So it's we probably use it about to probably 5% of its capacity, but we do find it helpful in large data sets. And so again, you can see if we were wanting to write something around one of these bigger codes around achieving resilience, perception of resilience achieved. So you can kind of work the data underneath it. And we went back through this data and sort of and had a look just at the bigger codes rather than the subcodes that were underneath, and we managed to get an analysis, a fairly broad analysis out of this particular data set of 14 guys. So again, I just say that your analysis is about constant engagement. Like most things, it's about time with the data, but also time away from the data. So if you've got people who you can talk with about the data and what you're thinking and seeing within the data, that can be a really great way of developing your analysis. Ideally, those people are people who are on your team, because they understand the context of the of what you're doing and what you're looking for, and the stylistic ways in which you'd write it up and think about it. So analysis-wise, we spend a lot of time together in the research teams, talking about the data and trying to work our way through to consensus. And oftentimes, it's part of your methods that you'll be writing up to say, well, this is how we got to this point, this is how we worked through the analysis. And oftentimes people are talking about the same thing. They might have different labels for what they're talking about. They might agree on the findings, but just how they're represented, can often, it's often the fun work of it to try and negotiate that with your co-investigators and work your way through. This slide is interesting because, it's that notion that, there is the potential for paradox. So I can see something very, very differently to other people on the team. And then we need to go back to the questions, usually the research questions. We need to talk about the data and the fit. And whilst we don't count, the number of times something happens necessarily within a transcript or across a data set in qualitative work, I do think that sometimes, we do start to think about how the strength of a particular theme or the strength of a particular finding based on how many times people kind of do say it, or how present it is within a particular transcript. And so, while we don't officially count, I do think we think about the strength of themes. And again, Sally Thorne was a great mentor of mine, and she warned me once very early on about, the seduction of the outlier. That you're in the data so much that there's this kind of moment where you might think, oh, I'll write about the unusual story because that's really interesting, even though it's not representative of findings. So, privileging the outlier has a place in some work, but typically way after we've actually got the results out that really reflect and represent, the entire sample and the findings. So again, that potential for paradox, sometimes people can have an orientation towards the outlier, which you've got to kind of work against to try and get what's there in terms of representation. The other piece with that people often talk to me about is about theory. So they get this analysis, do a nice descriptive analysis based on the findings, and then they go, I've got this theoretical framework that I want to anchor onto this. And it's interesting. It scares a lot of people off from qualitative work, but I'd argue it's actually a really important part of qualitative work, most qualitative work. So, for example, I've got on the slide there, things like socioeconomic status, beware of the working class, masculinity represented by the little boy down the bottom, and feminism in a couple of pictures there, as well as, there's a First Nations fella there. So oftentimes, within the context of the sample or within the way in which we're thinking about the data, we'll anchor a framework on it. And people will say, well, do I do that while I'm doing the analysis, or do I add that on after I've got my descriptive piece out? And I guess the answer to that is that when you're starting out and you're kind of new to the framework that you're working with, so for example, I use gender and I use masculinity as a framework that I look at. When I was first starting out, I would write it out descriptively, and then I'd layer on the masculinities piece. But as time goes on and I've gotten more familiar with the masculinities piece, it's very natural for me to just thread it in, probably very early on into the analysis. So again, you want to have a framework, a theory that you're working with the data and asking questions of the data. And so I think it is a good place to be and a good place to work with qualitative data. But decide early on what that framework is, because it goes back to your data collection. You ask certain questions that lend themselves well to particular frameworks. So if I'm doing a paper about place and space, I really want to know about locale-specific perspectives of people. If I'm doing a study that's looking at masculinity in particular, I want to know what the participants think about other men, or about women's interactions with men or particular aspects. So again, it kind of the framework you need up front, and then with your analysis, you want to build it in, but you want to not force it. You want to get your findings out and then try and build it into the findings, if as you go, or else after the fact, depending on your comfort level and familiarity with the theory that you're doing. People again talk about trustworthiness of the whole process, and it's true. You sort of, we get a lot of reviews back, around papers, and people go, well, how do you know that, and how do you work through that? So the processes that I've just described are the exact things that we write up in the methods. We talk about going with the research question, going through the data, highlighting the particular pieces of data that relate to the research question, then working through to codes, then working with the codes to come up with to inductively derive an analysis around themes or categories, and subsuming some of those and collapsing some of those until we get down to 2 or 3 or 4 themes that seem to represent the data. And we talk about how we do that within a team approach. And so it's really about that trustworthiness is about the process. Someone once said to me that 99% of the time you can trust in a decision if the process is transparent, and I think it's very true of qualitative work. So you want to make that very transparent in terms of your methods, and you don't have a lot of room oftentimes in journal articles, but to say what you did, exactly what you did, and how you did it, and that can help people understand how you arrived at some of the conclusions that you did and some of the findings. The other thing is around publishing. I would argue that it's on all of us to publish. Graduates especially and faculty. It's part of the deliverable of a grant. And when someone sponsors you, or when you do something for a degree, it's on all of us. And I think some of the best analysis happens in the writing up of the papers. So I find it quite interesting that we'll have upward of 15 or 20 drafts of a paper. Just version after version, and our analysis gets better and better and better. And I can't tell you how many papers start out with the 3 themes that we're sure of this, and then as time goes on and we all get into the writing of the paper, we start to jockey around for position with certain themes and start to change some things up. And it really is a reflection of the analysis developing, and also the theory getting layered on a lot of times as well. So, while people sometimes criticise, publications and things like that as being, about people's careers, I actually find it incredibly important to the analysis. So my analysis gets better with every empirical cut of the data, but also within papers. That's where I find that a lot of our work starts to really come together. So again, I just throw that out there in terms of it shouldn't be done in isolation. If you're able to work with a team, it's one of those things that can really help. And I think in writing up your findings, it continues to work. In the process of draft after draft after draft of the publications. Thank you.